said, welcome everyone to this month's Planning Live, which is a conversation with Kirsty Macari and Rachel Lang. My name is George Sismey-Durrant. I'm an associate in the planning team at Brodie's. So for quite a while, we've had discussions around local authority resourcing and resourcing generally in the planning system. And largely that's focused previously on kind of money and funding. And what we're seeing a bit more of now, we think, is actually looking at kind of the need for qualified and experienced bodies, basically planning bodies. And so we're focusing perhaps, while the issue of money is still there, the focus perhaps now is more on human resources rather than how big the pockets are. So today, to discuss these, as we said, Neil Collar will be principally asking the questions. He's the co-head of planning at Brodie's. Then we've got Kirsty Macari, who's co-head of undergraduate for architecture and urban planning and contemporary art practice at the University of Dundee, and is also a convener of the Royal Town Planning Institute Scotland. And then finally, we've got Brodie's own Rachel Lang, who's a people engagement advisor at Brodie's, and she joined us in 2019. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Neil.
Welcome to Kirsty and also to Rachel. And as George said, looking today to have a discussion around making sure that there's enough people, qualified people within the planning system. As some of the audience will be aware, this is something that RTPI Scotland have been looking at over the last few years. In particular, thinking of their Future Planners report, which is well worth a read. And I thought we could structure today's conversation around three key themes that identified. And the first theme there was promoting the importance of planning as a career. So I suppose it's very much thinking of the bathtub analogy, that you've got to start actually filling the bathtub. And it's probably quite a useful one in the sense that as people leave the profession, whether they're going to different career opportunities or retiring, the bathtub starts to empty. So you need to keep it topped up, as it were. So thinking about promoting the importance of planning as a career as that first theme, we can't shy away from the fact that there's a danger that planners are being seen as the say no profession, as it were. It's very easy for people to focus on that negative aspect and not see the positive aspect. And those of you who follow blogs will have maybe seen the blog I did on Clarkson's Farm. And that's a great example of how the planning profession is maybe not being shown necessarily in the best light, if I can put it at that most neutral. So tossing that maybe to Kirsty, what do you think can be done to attract people to actually become planners? And I suppose this is partly saying, with your university hat, why come and study planning?
Thanks, Neil. Well, yeah, I think probably starting even just with a scary statistic that, over the next between 10 and 15 years, that Future Planners report that you spoke about estimates we're going to need circa 700 planners. Now, a good chunk of those 550 to 600-ish will be to replace those that are retiring. So they're going down that plug hole, or they're leaving. And then because of the anticipated growth, they're looking at somewhere in the region of another 130 planners. And I think it's going to be really crucial over the next sort of 5 to 10 years, never mind the 10 to 15, to get people in the door. And yeah, the biggest thing I get from students, perhaps maybe ones that are doing geography or other courses, they come and get a taster for planning at Dundee through their options, and they say, I didn't know planning existed. It's a thing, it's a career. How did I not know about this? This is really exciting. And I guess we can't have everything in the curriculum. The easy fix would be, okay, let's put planning in the curriculum at school. Let's replace geography. with planning or a component of it, that would be, you know, a great easy fix, and it's not there. And, you know, even though we're out, we're speaking to guidance counsellors, we're speaking to geography teachers, there are so many priorities. You know, people know what an architect is. Okay, I want to do architecture, I like drawing, I like tech, I want to be an architect. And it's only once, I guess, they come and get that experience at the university that they realise that there is actually something there that allows you to do either the social or the, you know, even the design side, the urban design, placemaking side of what planning can be. And it's not always then that no profession. And I think probably I see little glimmers coming from the legislation coming out, you know, the need to engage with young people, children and young people as part of the Planning Act. They're going to be fantastic starting points for us. But I think it also makes us think about actually what is the path that might be part university, part work as well, and how we're going to manage that, I guess, in the future. And I guess it's seeing where things like maybe even Architecture and Design Scotland, where they talk about planning, but in maybe a slightly different way. And maybe that's the positive side of it that comes from it, the talking about place. And that tends to be what I do when I'm talking on behalf of the university, is talk about place and planning being an intrinsic part of it as a driver. And I think it's how we manage the expectations of people moving forward. It must be working. We're seeing our numbers going up, which is fantastic, but they're probably not going up quick enough to meet the demands of the profession.
Thanks. That's really good to hear that there are those positives. And Rachel, to bring you in, I thought it was going to be useful for the audience to maybe do a bit of comparison with experiences within the legal profession. And I suppose, picking up on what Kirsty said, the legal profession has the advantage that everyone thinks they know what lawyers do, not necessarily just quite what we do, but leave that to one side. So we maybe don't have to work as hard to attract people in. It's one of the old-fashioned professions, you know, sort of law, accountancy, medicine, that in some ways people aspire to. But I know there's still a need to broaden the backgrounds of people coming into the profession, but equally just to acknowledge that the legal profession is still in some ways struggling to attract people and still having to fill that bathtub, as it were. So can you give us some examples of what Brodie's have done to be attracting people to aspire to be lawyers?
Yeah, definitely. So we have, like you said, a different issue. Everybody knows what a lawyer is and that it's a career, and a lot of students aspire to it from a young age, but there is a misconception around what being a lawyer is. There's a certain kind of, I hope it's improving, but there's a certain kind of elitism and almost snobbery to the idea of being a lawyer, which we kind of try to mitigate through things like career insight days, where we allow students in S4 to S6 to come in to each of our offices to hear from our trainees basically about what being a lawyer actually is, through sessions throughout the whole day. And we just had one in our Aberdeen, Edinburgh and Glasgow offices in March, and the feedback around that was, you know, I didn't realise so much, like there was so much potential from a career in law. I didn't realise what it actually was, and these people are just like me. There's so many different types of law you can get involved in, but then also with a more holistic focus on, you know, like a work-life balance. People think potentially that being a lawyer is being up all hours of the night working, and that's definitely not the case for the most part these days. And so really just getting rid of those misconceptions around what being a lawyer is. And so we do that on a large part through our career insight days, which we run twice a year in each of our 3 offices in Scotland. But we also are members of Prime, which is aimed at students from a lower socioeconomic background, and we offer paid work experience to around 30 students every year through that programme, which works amazingly. And I could give you statistics to track where they kind of sit, but just to say it is successful, and we have current trainees and current solicitors who went through that programme to attract, as you were saying, a broader range of candidates and talent, which is brilliant, because I think, you know, it's not just planning and law. There's a skill shortage across different industries, but I suppose for planning it's more of a I didn't even realise this was a career, I didn't realise what it was issue, whereas law, it's a misconception around what it actually is like to be a lawyer currently.
Interestingly, I was talking to a transportation person during the week who, again, comparing notes about stage children are at, and he was talking about children going along to careers days, and he has 2 daughters who are interested in doing law. Should be trying to persuade them into planning, really, shouldn't I? And he was saying that they'd found being able to go along to, I think it was maybe a careers day at the school, and talking to lawyers. I think he thought Brodie's were actually at the school as well. But that sort of insight they had found really useful. And I suppose this is where we should maybe stop and acknowledge that it's one thing an organisation as big as Brodie's, we have that benefit of scale to be able to say, well, yes, we can take some people away from their desk and take them to a career day. It's much harder if there's only 2 or 3 people in your organisation. But I think that's where the planning profession needs to be thinking of the art of the possible, and you know, whether it's linking together or RTPI Scotland through volunteers or something, but looking at those possibilities and saying, well, yes, it's maybe a big ask of individual organisations, but if we can do some teaming up, as it were, and just to show how my brain becomes a bit random, I'm thinking of, is it the Chief Planner Initiative they talk about where they're shadowing?
Yeah.
So it's examples of that. It's all around that theme of alerting people to possibilities and potentials, rather than just, well, I wouldn't think of doing that because I didn't know it existed.
Yeah, I think you're right, Neil. Absolutely. Yeah. It's the chief planners, it's the looking, I guess, at the collective number of planners across Scotland as well, and it's looking at elements of things like the Scottish Young Planners, who are 20 years old this year, believe it or not, and you know, they're the ones that want to get out there and speak to the schools, and it's just that finding a way to coordinate it all. You would almost have thought you were sitting in my future planners working group earlier this week, because that's exactly what we were talking about. How do we get that coordination to be as slick and as effective as possible?
There you are. You see, we can actually hit the right themes without doing planning and collaborating too far in advance. The second of the themes from the Future Planners report was about broadening routes into the profession. So that's sort of saying, right, we've whetted your interest, you want to be a planner. How are you actually going to become a planner? And in common with the legal profession, inevitably, there a certain amount of different options or combinations about whether undergrad, postgrad, and then how you go about actually achieving your professional certification, as it was RTPI for planners, Law Society for lawyers, but not getting into the detail of that particularly, but thinking about the general theme. Kirsty, again, maybe from your university experience, if you can just chat us through the issues around broadening routes into the planning profession.
Yeah, of course. And I think it's that thing, you're already whetting their appetite, and they might have even gone and done a little bit of a placement. We're hearing more people, more local authorities offering taster days or taster weeks to people that are thinking about going into planning, which is fantastic, or maybe are at college. And so it's for us, some of the biggest challenges, I guess, are we would love to have lots of homegrown talent, but we have things like caps on the student numbers, the number of home student numbers that we can have. So that can create a challenge. So while in Scotland we're screaming out for planners, we have to balance that in terms of the intake of numbers. So we're looking at different ways that we can facilitate that. We're getting or seeing a steadier increase, I guess, in numbers coming into year one, which I think is helpful. But what we're also seeing is those wanting to come in direct at year two by creating pathways through colleges. We've just done something with Fife College, looking at an opportunity for people to join us direct at year two. So they're coming with a bit of an interest already in the system, but they're maybe coming from a broader background. So they might have done architectural technology, for example, before they actually come and decide to do planning. And that's great. We're doing a lot around the widening access as well. So it was interesting hearing what Rachel was saying around looking at sort of diverse backgrounds. We're doing quite a bit to push that as well in Scotland, but it's looking at the what else. In apprenticeships, they're up and running in England. RTPI Scotland are looking at that just now with Skills Development Scotland and Scottish Government. But I actually think we maybe need to be a little bit bolder than that as well. I think in Scotland we've got an opportunity to be quite creative around what our planning education could be because of our geography, because of the investment that we've seen in terms of the technology and approaches that we can use to teaching, which might open up opportunities. And I think that's going to be necessary. I've spoken about a third of the heads of planning over the last 2 weeks, beginning to sound them out about what the ideal education set of choices would look like for them. And some of that is just the logistics of travel for their staff. They're willing, they're welcoming, taking on people direct from school and supporting them maybe in a apprenticeship style approach to learning. But they're also recognise that there are people that might just want to get the practice experience and then come and do a postgrad with us as well, and that's something we can offer at Dundee. So it's how do we make that work for us? So how do we use digital technology to make the learning experience effective and efficient, I guess, for our future planners and the employers at the same time as well. But definitely a few challenges ahead, not necessarily in terms of just the different routes, but what actually the shape of, I guess, planning education across the whole of the UK is going to look like as well. I'm involved just now in some education policy review with the RTPI, and it's quite exciting, reshaping a little bit of the curriculum. But we've also got to be mindful of how do we let that be a responsive curriculum to the future challenges that planning is trying to address around climate and economy and social issues.
And maybe just picking up a little on what you were saying towards the end there, it sounds as though being a planner now is quite different from being a planner a while back, if I can put it as most vague. And you were mentioning there the key issues, that change that we're seeing, that climate emergency is the key theme in NPF4. You mentioned digital planning, and you know, that's where I can present myself as a dinosaur. That when I started as a trainee solicitor, almost no lawyer had a computer. There was no email, etc., etc. You know, I can go on. I think for me, I'm very interested to see what digital planning will involve, because it's one of those blanket terms that could mean a lot of different things. But do you feel, because of that evolution, it's not just about the skills people need, but it's also perhaps different people might now be interested in being planners, whereas 20 years ago, their approach, their skill set, their interests wouldn't have made planning an interesting profession?
Yeah, I do actually think it does open it up for a whole set of new people. And I think that's where we're seeing people coming to retrain as planners as well. Dare I say it, we actually took somebody who trained to do, had done law as their first degree and decided they wanted to be a planner instead and came and did our postgraduate. But their perspective on planning was really interesting in terms of how they could support their peers on the course in things like looking at, the Planning Act, for example. But yeah, you're seeing people coming from different backgrounds who want that professional accreditation as well, or are really interested in mapping and GIS and see where there is a route for them as planners moving forward. But even I think as we, I guess, take the digital a little bit step further into the design side of stuff, and seeing illustrators, people that have maybe trained initially in illustration, want to come through because they want to be part of, the visual preparation of our plans and our communication that we do with sort of out in the community with other people. So it absolutely opens it up. I think in terms of where it's going, in terms of some of the skills, it's seeing the education and the curriculum shifting to be adaptable and responsive to actually the needs of planning, and really thinking of the future. Dare I say, when I did my planning degree a long time ago, my planning law was assessed by an exam in an exam hall for 3 hours with a memory. And if anybody knows me, my memory is terrible. Give me some notes, I'm fine. And when I joined the university, that was still how they assessed planning law. And speaking to practice and experience in practice, it just didn't add up. So we shifted the assessment. So now they are assessed on their knowledge by going through scenarios that they would come across then in practice. It's preparing them, I think, better for practice, but it's actually testing our sort of pedagogical approaches as well. So it's very much about real life, real scenario, place-based learning too. And I think that's an advantage for lots of different people.
Rachel, Kirsty mentioned on the way through there about apprenticeships and how that's something that RTPI Scotland are looking at. And I know there's a structural issue, which means it's happening in England, but not in Scotland. But that's something that is being looked at very seriously, as Kirsty said. But Rachel, maybe if you could tell us a bit about Brodie's experience with apprenticeships. Unfortunately, as with planners, something that we can't do for legal staff yet, but we have done it with marketing, IT, key staff who are in roles alongside the lawyers. So Rachel, be interested to hear a bit about Brodie's journey, as it were, on the apprenticeship side of things.
Yeah, so obviously apprenticeships are super valuable. Basically, for the final point Kirsty was making there about, learning while you're getting practical hands-on experience, it's very effective. You can also earn money while you're learning, which, currently is a big concern with the cost of living crisis coming in. So yeah, we're in the same position for our legal colleagues, unfortunately, that there's not a framework in place in Scotland that you can do a legal apprenticeship to become a qualified lawyer. They have it in England, and it's been quite effective down there. It's been rolled out over the last few years, and more firms are signing up. And I read some great success stories, and I just think, I wish we could do that here. We are regulated by the SRA. We do have English qualified lawyers, so it is a consideration for the future when it's a bit more viable for us. but it just provides a structured career development route for students. Gives them the kind of route into a job, learning in a more hands-on way. But then for the employer, it's improved retention, engagement, and it's a recruitment tool that broadens routes into the profession. So it's really worked well for us in the roles that we've done it with. Our apprentices progress into new roles and they bring new knowledge, and they've been learning on the job, so our values are really instilled in them. But yeah, it is definitely a really viable way of broadening the route into the profession, especially if you're struggling to get that kind of intake.
And I couldn't help think of my eldest son, who's at a university which isn't Dundee and is doing something which isn't planning, but every time we talk to him, so how was your day, he has another moan about how a lecturer's managed to make what was potentially an interesting subject quite dull. And I suspect he might actually be the kind of person who would be better in an apprenticeship, but maybe next year will be better. So the third of the key themes from Future Planners report, once you've got people in the profession, is actually retaining them through career progression. So giving them a feeling that there actually is a career and that they're not going to be stuck doing the same job, which I guess for a lot of local authority planners is dormer windows, extensions on houses, and just the humdrum. And one of the things obviously is thinking about continuing professional development, CPD, and I'm aware, because I'm a legal associate of the RTPI, of the personal development plan component, which compared to the Law Society CPD that I also have to perform, the PDP is great for giving that focus of, you do your strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats, you identify the weaknesses, you think about what you can do in the next year or two. It gives it that focus, and that's very valuable. But Kirsty, do you think that's enough?
Good question. If I'm honest, I don't. I think it comes down obviously the individuals. I've gone in education, so I love learning, and I've always loved it. But maybe we get ourselves a little bit caught up into how busy work is, and the fixation on sort of 50 hours of CPD, which is set out across those 2 years. And I think a lot of the onus comes on the individuals to think about how they can progress themselves forward, perhaps be a bit more transformative in their learning. RTPI talk about lifelong learning. I really think where we are, particularly in Scotland with MPF4, that we need to be looking at transformative learning, so going beyond. And that's going to be quite challenging, I think, for individuals who are probably looking at that SWOT analysis and just thinking a year ahead, 2 years ahead. We really have to be thinking, I think, 5 years ahead. How do I get to where I want to be? How do we use, I guess, the skills of the students going out as well? How can they help almost mentor the staff and the placements that they're going into to some of those future skills? Maybe it's not the other way around. So often you would go out into your new place of work as a new graduate and you're being mentored. Maybe it's the other way around for some of that as well, in terms of how we address some of the new planning skills that we need. But I think there's, I guess, a challenge in the scale that Scotland is, the number of small private sector consultancies. We don't have that big scale in which we can embed lots of CPD, but you do see some local authorities doing some really good work. A number of them investing in sort of a half-day CPD every month for their staff, bringing the staff together, building up that essence of a team as well. And maybe that's what can inspire people to go and do that a little bit more. There's not an onus on individual chief planners to develop CPD. Obviously, it would be really good practice if they do, but how do you balance that really when the onus comes down to the individual planner just now? And I think there's a role for the RTPI, particularly around the digital skills. How do we build that and share that out? But also, how do we build on the opportunities? So again, spoken about Scotland being small, but maybe that's a good thing. And the fact that we know people, we know planning, everybody sort of knows each other. So if you know somebody's got a really good skill or a good interest in something, we should be building on that opportunity to share. And it's like the likes of these webinars, I guess, as well, Neil. There's always a little bit of something for people to be able to listen into and build up, whether it's a webinar, whether it's an in-person conference, or ways in which people can learn now. And I think we need to embrace that and really build that in to what our working week looks like.
Yeah, and Rachel, there's an important theme there in the sense that we can all get very blinkered about getting on with the day job and keeping the plates spinning and all the rest, and inevitably training, skills development, all of that can take a bit of a back seat. You got any hints for organisations about what they can do to stop that happening? Because it's a bit of a slippery slope that it just becomes training can have less and less of a priority, and before you know it, there's nothing happening.
Yeah, so it's quite difficult. I'm not going to pretend to be naive to the fact that we're talking about smaller organisations and sometimes individual consultants in the case of the planning profession, but there's like little steps you can take. So there's potential for internal training from more experienced colleagues, passing knowledge and best practice. We have a firm-wide training programme here at Brodie's where it's delivered by colleagues for colleagues, and sharing that knowledge, really thinking outside the box in terms of, what's valuable for people, not just in terms of your actual job, but soft skills and things like that. The Skills Development Scotland research paper into the capacity and skills in planning showed that many experienced planners will be leaving the sector over the medium term, and that really means that there's a massive amount of experience and knowledge leaving the profession, and so there is that potential to harness that knowledge. But then, like Kirsty was saying, there's the potential to harness the knowledge of students coming in, potentially new skills, new ways of learning, new ways of working that can be kind of passed on to the older generations of work. And I don't want to say the older generations, but you know what I mean, the more experienced colleagues who potentially don't have that experience that younger colleagues have, and that's reverse mentoring. So there is a name for it. Reverse mentoring is when a more junior colleague mentors someone more experienced, and that's been shown to be quite valuable in certain organizations, and there's no reason why it couldn't be valuable there. In terms of embedding a culture of learning, making it more habitual for employees to take on that kind of learning in the CPD, you need to provide learning and development opportunities that align to employees' interests and goals, or skills gaps. And so sometimes it starts as providing it to them, and then eventually they might, hopefully the goal is for them to take some of that on themselves and continue that learning journey. Prioritize learning and performance reviews where possible, make it an objective for employees, and then just foster a supportive learning environment, make it accessible, habitual, and encourage colleagues, and just lead by example. So leaders need to be involved as well, potentially by doing some of the training themselves, potentially by participating in some training, things like that. That really helps in my experience. For what you were kind of talking about in terms of connecting with other people, as you said, it's a small country, so if you know people, maybe connect those smaller organizations and individual consultants into a sort of network where you can have maybe a monthly meeting or a monthly training session, and somebody's nominated to speak on a certain topic, or make it a mentoring network where people are partnered up, more senior, more junior, it really doesn't matter, just to share that kind of knowledge. If it is more senior and junior, you've got that senior to junior knowledge sharing, but also potential for reverse mentoring there as well. But I'm done lecturing now, so I hope that kind of helped.
Well, I think apart from anything, it ticked Kirsty's box of we've now all learned something from today, reverse mentoring. So that's our CPD win of this discussion, something specific to point to. Kirsty, it was occurring to me just through the discussion, there's maybe a danger that a lot of these positive aspects are already addressed as planners go through RTPI accreditation, because there's a pathway there, and it's clear what they have to achieve, and procedures are set in place, and there's a logbook and mentoring. Is the danger then, once people are accredited, that safety net, as it were, probably not a good way of putting it, but that structure suddenly isn't there, and that's the time perhaps that planners, but their colleagues or employers, need to try a bit harder because the structure suddenly vanished?
Yeah, I think it's almost, doesn't it? It becomes the APC process becomes that guiding, a guide or a zone in which to work towards that tangible outcome, because you're working towards your APC. And beyond that, it's, I don't know, maybe at times perhaps thought about as maintenance, maintenance of knowledge, skills, thinking about the fact, well, I've done my education, now I'm just doing the work. And I wonder if that's partly what has maybe caused a little bit of concern about all the new duties and the changes that need to happen in terms of delivering MPF4, because we've almost lost sight of the fact that we need to train for the future, not train for now. And I think it's how do you build that in, and maybe that's something that needs to be looked at as how do you set those predictions, those 5 years, maybe those 10 years. I dread to think about anything beyond 5 years with IT and digital, because I don't think anybody understands what that'll look like. But yeah, I think it becomes normal day-to-day practice, and I think we need to look at it as, and I think that's where that transformative bit comes in. The fact we should be constantly transforming as individuals, as planners, as we respond to these different crises. We didn't expect a pandemic. We've responded through it. We've learned through it. We're talking about global crisis, climate emergency. That didn't get mentioned in my planning curriculum 20 odd years ago. So we need to be able to think and respond and be responsive. But some of it's about resilience, I think, of planners as well. There's been a report just come out that highlights some of the pressures around misinformation that comes out on social media about planning, and how do you build some learning in around resilience of digital and social media for things like planners, and some of the impact that's had on them. So there's so many avenues. It's not even just about keeping up with the legislation. It's about all these other components that really make us a really strong and resilient profession, I think.
And the social media topic is a brilliant example, because a lot of people wouldn't think that's anything to do with training, skills, etc., etc. But I know I chaired a session for colleagues to try and encourage them to use Twitter, because I know you do, Kirsty, as well. So we can see the advantages. The difficulty is it's very easy for people to get put off by all the bad stories, etc., etc. But that's where there is a role for saying, well, if you can get experience through other people's experience, that breaks down the fear factor, and that may well then be that you have a new communication tool. And the beauty of social media, as Kirsty and myself know, is that it's very flexible. You can use it for a huge variety of different things. So that's quite a good mini example of things that possibly a lot of planners, definitely a lot of lawyers, wouldn't want to touch with a barge pole, but if they're given the opportunity to hear a bit more, might be encouraged into thinking, well, that's something that I could do, rather than, as you were saying, Kirsty, it being a bit of a closed agenda of the predictable sort of training topics. Just in the last few minutes before we finish up, Kirsty, wearing your RTPI Scotland hat, this is your opportunity, reach out to the members. What can the individual members do? Because I think for every profession, there's always an element of the member sitting saying, well, it's for the institute to do stuff. So this is your opportunity to say, well, the institute does good things, but the members can step up as well. So what would you say to members?
I guess it's take any opportunity that's there. You're right, there are already things that are maybe driven by the institute. So there is the Scottish Young Planners Network. You know, if we look at what's going on in Scotland, you're seeing groups set up now for things like neurodiversity in planning, which is basically being driven by members recognising that there's synergies in terms of supporting themselves, peer-to-peer support, but also in terms of how you might understand communicating with neurodiverse members of the community as well. So there's a really good sort of set of practice around that. I think it's not got to be complicated either. It can be a webinar. It doesn't have to be going and doing a postgraduate degree, albeit I would welcome anybody to come and do that. Looking at different things. For me, it was doing a training session on design thinking, of all things, and looking at big problems and how I could break them down. For me, that was eye-opening. I wouldn't have linked it directly to planning, but it's, you know, so look at different things. Don't just look at what the planning training is, look at what the value might be to the planning sector if you undertake the training in something else. So go out, speak to people, share your thoughts. If you've got an idea or you've got an idea that you want to share, get in touch with me or get in touch with Craig at the RTPI. If there's things we can do to help facilitate groups together, by all means, we will do it. Social media, you'll get me on that. That's, you know, that's where I have loads of conversations. Just take some ownership, take some actual ownership of your learning. Don't see it as an obligation, see it as something that you really want to embrace and actually enjoy it. I found that as I got older, I actually enjoy the education side of it now.
Brilliant. That's a very good place and positive place to finish. Thank you, the three of you, for taking part today, and I hope everyone who attended found it very useful.